The power goes out at 9:17 a.m. You don't panic. Not at first. You assume it's local, a blown transformer, a storm somewhere. You check your phone. No signal. Wi-Fi is dead. The screen still lights up, but nothing loads. You drive to the gas station. The pumps don't work. The doors are locked. Inside, the clerk is standing in the dark holding a flashlight. By noon, traffic lights are out. Accidents begin stacking up at major intersections. Police respond, but radio systems are unstable. By evening, grocery stores are crowded. Not frantic, just uneasy. People are buying more than usual, just in case. Day 2 feels different. Shelves are empty. Credit cards don't process. ATMs don't function. Refrigeration units begin warming. Pharmacies stop filling prescriptions. On day 3, something changes. You realize the trucks aren't coming. Modern cities do not store food. They move it constantly. Remove electricity and digital coordination and distribution stops. Remove distribution and inventory becomes memory. Hospitals switch to generators, but diesel reserves are finite. Water treatment plants struggle without steady power. Elevators in high-rises remain frozen. By day 5, insulin is rationed. Dialysis patients are turned away. No bombs fell. No invasion occurred. The system simply stopped flowing. And when flow stops long enough, order thins. Here is the question that matters, and it will not go away. If the grid did not come back, how long before modern civilization begins to contract? Not disappear, contract. We are taught that history moves upward, from primitive to advanced, from stone to steel to silicon. A straight line of improvement. But the archaeological record tells a colder story. Civilization rises, stabilizes, expands. Then, under pressure, it shrinks. 3,200 years ago, the Mediterranean world was tightly connected. Egypt traded grain and gold. The Hittite Empire controlled trade routes. Mycenaean Greece built fortified palaces overlooking the sea. Ships carried copper and tin across vast distances. Kings exchanged letters. Treaties were signed. It felt permanent. Within a single generation, cities burned. Trade routes fractured. Writing systems vanished. Entire political structures dissolved. Not because people forgot how to think, because systems stopped synchronizing. The Bronze Age did not end in a single battle. It ended when trade weakened, bronze production faltered, armies thinned, and migration intensified. It happened faster than anyone living through it could have imagined, fast enough that parents believed it was temporary, until their children inherited a smaller world. Now return to the present. Electricity powers water. Digital systems coordinate food. Satellites guide transport and finance. We are more advanced than any civilization before us, but we are also more dependent. Remove one pillar, pressure rises. Remove several, and contraction begins. So ask it clearly. If our systems fail long enough, how long before scale shrinks? A year? A decade? One generation? Every civilization that collapsed believed it was different. Every one of them believed their systems were stable. The crest always feels steady, until it isn't. Imagine waking up in the year 1200 BCE. You are not ancient. You live in a world of trade, diplomacy, and power. Ships cross the Mediterranean carrying metal, grain, and luxury goods. Letters travel between kings. Armies are trained, equipped, confident. Your world feels stable. Then one shipment doesn't arrive. It is tin. Copper is common. Tin is rare. Without tin, bronze weakens. Without bronze, weapons bend. Plows crack, armor fails. At first it feels like delay, a caravan rerouted. a port disrupted, a minor conflict somewhere far away. You assume it will stabilize. But the next shipment is late too. Then grain harvests shrink in certain regions. Drought lingers longer than expected. Refugees begin moving along coastlines, not as conquerors, as survivors. Your army is still standing. Your walls are still intact. Your king is still issuing orders, but something invisible is thinning. Trade weakens. Metal production slows. Military strength erodes quietly. And then cities begin to burn. Not all at once, not in one coordinated war. Different regions fracture under different pressures. Coastal settlements fall first. Inland alliances fail to respond quickly enough. We have letters from that time, desperate pleas for help. The enemy ships are here. Help never comes. Within decades, entire palace systems disappear. Writing systems vanish in parts of Greece for centuries. Literacy itself collapses in some regions. Knowledge does not fade gently. It drops. Parents who once lived in a connected Mediterranean world watch their children grow up in something smaller. Trade becomes local. Architecture simplifies. Political power fragments. Humanity survives. Scale does not. And here is the detail that should stay with you. No one living at the beginning of that collapse knew they were at the end of an age. They believed they were in crisis, a difficult period, a temporary breakdown. Crisis feels temporary until it becomes normal. Now bring it forward. If our own supply chains fractured, not for a week, not for a month, but long enough that restoration became uncertain, what happens? Microchip fabrication requires uninterrupted precision. Pharmaceutical production depends on global chemical inputs. Modern agriculture relies on fertilizer synthesized through energy-intensive processes. If those systems pause long enough, expertise begins to atrophy. You do not lose knowledge overnight. You lose practice. Lose practice long enough, and specialization thins. Lose specialization, and complexity shrinks. This is how contraction works, not with a dramatic reset to caves, with narrowing. Narrower trade, narrower coordination, narrower ambition. The Bronze Age did not end because people were primitive. It ended because a tightly connected system lost synchronization under sustained pressure. And synchronization is fragile. So the question tightens. If our tin, our microchips, our energy grids, our digital finance stopped flowing long enough, how quickly would our own world narrow? Not disappear, narrow. History suggests it can happen within a generation. The crest feels permanent when you are standing on it, but every crest in history has eventually rolled forward. The only unknown is whether we are different or simply larger. But collapse does not always arrive as burning cities. Sometimes it arrives as something quieter. No invasion, no dramatic collapse, just a river shifting, a rainfall pattern weakening, a system optimized too tightly for conditions that no longer hold. The Bronze Age fractured under cascading shocks, but what happens when nothing explodes and the foundation simply drifts? To understand that, we have to look further back, not at war, at water. If collapse were always violent, we would recognize it immediately. Smoke on the horizon, walls breached, cities in flames. But some civilizations do not fall that way. Some simply thin out. 4,000 years ago, along the Indus River system, one of the most advanced urban societies on Earth operated at full scale. Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira. These were not primitive clusters of huts. They were engineered environments. Streets laid out in deliberate grids, standardized brick dimensions consistent across hundreds of miles. Sophisticated drainage systems running beneath homes, covered sewers, private wells. Let that sink in. Indoor plumbing before much of Europe would see it again for millennia. This was not a marginal culture surviving on the edge of chaos. It was organized, calibrated, synchronized. And unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, it did not celebrate power through massive royal monuments. There are no towering statues of kings, no grand inscriptions boasting of conquest. What we see instead is system after system after system: water control, urban planning, standardized production. It was a civilization built not on spectacle, but on coordination. And then something happened. Not a single catastrophic event, not a uniform burn layer across all cities, not mass graves suggesting invasion. What archaeologists find instead is gradual urban decline. Brick quality becomes inconsistent. Maintenance appears neglected. Large public structures fall into disuse. Trade artifacts become less frequent. Populations disperse outward into smaller rural communities. It does not look like annihilation. It looks like contraction. The most unsettling possibility is that nothing dramatic happened at all. Climate evidence suggests river systems began shifting. Monsoon patterns altered over time. A major river artery may have weakened or changed course. Water, for a highly engineered civilization, is not optional. It is foundational. Urban density depends on predictable water. Agricultural surplus depends on predictable water. Sanitation systems depend on predictable water. When water shifts, everything shifts. But it does not shift all at once. A weaker monsoon one year can be absorbed. 2 weaker cycles in a decade raise concern. A pattern, sustained over generations, alters reality. Here is where the pattern becomes uncomfortable. The Indus civilization appears to have optimized its environment. Standardized bricks across vast territories suggest centralized planning and stable material supply. Dense urban cores suggest confidence in agricultural yield. Optimization increases efficiency, but optimization reduces slack. Slack is what absorbs shock. A small farming village can relocate when a river shifts. A large city built around permanent infrastructure cannot pivot so easily. The more complex the urban grid, the more energy it requires to maintain. When maintenance costs rise while returns shrink, something has to give. And what gives first is scale. Urban centers thin, skilled specialists disperse, trade, contracts. The radius of coordination tightens. People do not disappear. Civilization does not vanish into chaos, but the complexity that once defined it shrinks. From the inside, this does not feel like collapse. It feels like adaptation. Families move toward more reliable rainfall zones. Settlements decentralize. Large-scale coordination is replaced by smaller, local systems. It is rational, and that is precisely why it is dangerous. Because rational contraction can look like progress at first. If a city becomes too expensive to sustain, moving outward makes sense. If long-distance trade becomes unreliable, local production feels safer. But as coordination shrinks, specialization shrinks with it. Large urban societies support specialists, full-time administrators, engineers, artisans, traders. Smaller settlements require generalists. When specialization declines, certain forms of knowledge weaken. Complex systems require concentrated expertise. Disperse the population, and expertise disperses too. Within a few generations, memory of how large-scale coordination once functioned begins to fade. The Indus Valley case forces a sober realization. Technological sophistication does not guarantee resilience. In fact, the more tightly a society integrates its infrastructure with stable environmental patterns, the more vulnerable it becomes when those patterns drift. We assume modern engineering shields us from environmental variability, but our agriculture still depends on climate stability. Our cities still depend on water systems. Our energy grids still depend on predictable inputs. Efficiency has become our pride. Just-in-time delivery, lean production, optimized logistics. But lean systems leave little room for prolonged disruption. If stress continues long enough, maintaining complexity may cost more than it returns. And when that threshold is crossed, contraction becomes logical. The Indus cities were not conquered into oblivion. They were outpaced by shifting foundations. The people survived. The urban scale did not. That distinction matters because it suggests collapse is not necessarily failure of intelligence. It is failure of alignment. When infrastructure no longer matches environmental reality, it becomes a burden, and burdens are shed. The most unsettling part is not that it happened, it is that it happened without spectacle. No decisive battle to mark the end, no dramatic last stand, just thinning streets, abandoned structures, shrinking coordination. Which raises a sharper version of our central question. If our own environmental or energetic assumptions begin to drift, slowly, subtly, how long before we begin rational contraction? Not riots, not apocalypse, just decentralization, fragmentation, local adaptation replacing global synchronization. Would we call that collapse? Or would we call it reform, transition, sustainable restructuring? The Indus Valley teaches us something that should linger in the background of every modern confidence. Civilizations do not need to be destroyed to disappear. They can simply become smaller than they once were. And when scale is lost, rebuilding it is far harder than maintaining it ever was. Collapse does not begin with walls falling. It begins when maintenance slows. In the mature phase of the Indus civilization, brick ratios were precise, often in a consistent 1 to 2 to 4 proportion. That level of standardization across vast regions suggests coordination, shared measurement systems, oversight. Later layers tell a quieter story. Bricks become less uniform. Construction quality declines. Drainage systems are repaired less carefully. At first glance, these seem like small details. They are not. Standardization is expensive. It requires labor discipline, supply continuity, and administrative stability. When you see precision fade, you are not looking at incompetence. You are looking at pressure. Pressure from where? Climate reconstructions indicate long-term shifts in monsoon intensity. River channels that once supported dense settlement appear to have migrated. Agricultural predictability weakened. A city does not starve in one season. It strains. Urban density amplifies vulnerability. A farming household in isolation can absorb a bad year by tightening consumption. A dense city requires steady surplus from surrounding regions. When surplus narrows, distribution becomes fragile. Imagine food arriving less consistently, not absent, just inconsistent. Markets become volatile. Storage systems are stressed. Trust in coordination begins to thin. When trust thins, cooperation narrows. And when cooperation narrows, scale shrinks. The archaeological record suggests that many Indus urban centers did not explode into chaos. Instead, populations dispersed gradually toward regions with more reliable rainfall. This is the part that unsettles modern narratives. They did not fight to preserve the cities at any cost. They moved. It is possible that maintaining large urban cores simply became inefficient compared to decentralization. That shift would not feel like defeat. It would feel pragmatic. Yet pragmatism at scale is indistinguishable from contraction. As urban centers emptied, specialization declined. In a large city, one person can dedicate life to brick production, another to trade administration, another to hydraulic engineering. In smaller settlements, survival demands versatility. Specialization is replaced by generalization, and generalization reduces the complexity ceiling. Over generations, the knowledge required to sustain dense urban infrastructure may fade, not because it is forgotten intentionally, but because it is no longer practiced. Practice is memory. Without repetition, systems decay. This principle extends far beyond ancient brickwork. Modern civilization rests on specialized knowledge networks: electrical grid engineers, semiconductor designers, supply chain analysts, surgeons trained in rare procedures. These roles exist because scale supports them. If scale contracts significantly, can every specialization survive? If global trade fragments, can semiconductor fabrication remain concentrated in a few regions? If supply chains regionalize, can pharmaceutical production maintain its complexity? The Indus example reveals a sobering pattern. Urban contraction is not dramatic, it is generational. Children born into smaller settlements grow up without experiencing the full scale their grandparents knew. To them, reduced complexity feels normal. This normalization is critical. Collapse is rarely perceived as collapse by those living within it. It is perceived as adaptation to new conditions. Imagine if a future generation grows up in a world with limited global connectivity. Trade exists, but regionally. Technology exists, but simplified. Infrastructure operates, but less synchronized. Would they see it as decline, or simply as the way things are? The Indus Valley forces us to confront another uncomfortable reality. Environmental misalignment does not need to be catastrophic to be transformative. Slow drift can be as powerful as sudden shock. A river shifts course over decades. A rainfall pattern weakens over generations. The system adjusts, but adjustment has cost. When cost exceeds return, scale is shed. Civilization survives, but smaller. This distinction matters because modern society often equates survival with success. If people remain alive, we assume stability. But stability is not the same as scale. The Indus people did not vanish from existence. They reorganized into smaller communities. The urban coordination that once defined their civilization diminished. Scale did not collapse into nothing. It contracted into something manageable. And that is perhaps the most dangerous model for us to consider. Because it suggests that modern civilization does not need to implode spectacularly to change fundamentally. It only needs sustained pressure. If environmental patterns shift faster than infrastructure adapts, if energy systems strain beyond sustainable maintenance, if coordination becomes too expensive relative to benefit, then contraction becomes rational. Not ideological, not emotional. Rational. The Indus story is not one of ignorance. It is one of misalignment between complex systems and changing foundations. When foundations shift, even the most sophisticated grids weaken. And once large-scale coordination dissolves, rebuilding it requires centuries, if conditions ever allow. Which brings us back again to the central question quietly tightening beneath every example. If our own environmental and systemic assumptions begin to drift, how long before we start shedding complexity? Not because we want to, because we must. There is something more unsettling than collapse. Choice. When cities burn, we understand it. Violence leaves explanation behind. War has cause and consequence. But what do we do with a civilization that does not burn, that does not erode, that does not get conquered but is deliberately sealed? Göbekli Tepe sits on a hill in southeastern Turkey. Today it looks like exposed stone rings and towering pillars carved with animals, foxes, snakes, boars, vultures. The site dates back nearly 11,000 years. That is older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than pottery. It was built before large-scale agriculture was firmly established. That alone disrupts the linear story we like to tell. We assume complex monuments require settled farming societies. Yet here, massive limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons were carved and erected by people we classify as hunter-gatherers. To move stones of that size requires coordination, planning, shared belief, leadership, labor specialization. In other words, scale. And then something happened that defies our expectations. The enclosures were buried. Not destroyed, not shattered. Buried. Layer by layer, the structures were filled with soil, debris, stone fragments, even animal bones. The pillars were protected by the act of burial. The covering appears deliberate and systematic. Imagine the effort required. It likely took as much labor to entune those structures as it did to build them. This was not abandonment through neglect. It was closure through intention. The people who built Göbekli Tepe did not lose the capacity to maintain it. They chose to stop. That distinction matters. Because collapse implies failure. Burial implies transition. One possibility is that the site functioned as a ritual gathering place for dispersed groups. Monumental architecture may have helped unite scattered communities in shared ceremony. But as agriculture expanded in the region, life changed. Settlements became more permanent. Food production tied people to specific land. Social structures reorganized around fields and property rather than mobility. A monument designed for one social pattern may have become irrelevant in another. So it was sealed. Think carefully about what that means. A society can outgrow its own symbols, and when it does, it may not dismantle them violently. It may cover them, preserving them for memory while removing them from daily life. This is a different model of civilizational change. Not destruction, not environmental drift, intentional simplification. What if the complexity represented by Göbekli Tepe no longer matched the survival strategy of the community? Large gatherings require surplus. Surplus requires predictability. If environmental patterns shifted, or if smaller agricultural units proved more efficient, monumental ritual centers may have become costly luxuries. When survival pressures rise, luxuries are first to go, even sacred ones. That reveals something deeply human. We assume knowledge accumulates without loss, but knowledge also becomes obsolete. Systems built for one context become burdens in another. In that moment, societies make decisions. What do we preserve? What do we abandon? What do we bury? Göbekli Tepe suggests that sometimes civilization contracts not because it is overwhelmed, but because it reorganizes. From a long historical perspective, the burial looks like disappearance. From the inside, it may have felt like progress. This duality complicates our central question. If contraction is sometimes chosen, then collapse is not always tragedy. It can be adaptation. But adaptation downward still reduces scale. Once buried, the knowledge embedded in monumental architecture is no longer practiced. Skills tied to its maintenance fade. Future generations may never learn the techniques their ancestors mastered. Rebuilding that scale centuries later requires rediscovery. Consider the implications for modern society. Our monuments are not only physical, they are digital, financial, infrastructural. Server farms storing immense knowledge, global networks coordinating trade and communication, massive energy grids sustaining cities. If maintaining those systems becomes unsustainable, financially, environmentally, politically, would we dismantle them? Or would they fail chaotically? The builders of Göbekli Tepe had one advantage. Their complexity was still local and physical. They could close it with labor. Our complexity is planetary, and planetary systems do not shut down neatly. The burial of Göbekli Tepe also reminds us that archaeology only sees what survives. Had those pillars not been carefully entombed, erosion would likely have erased them entirely. We might never know that such coordination existed that early in human history. How many other achievements have vanished because they were not sealed? History is biased toward stone. Modern civilization is biased toward electricity. Electricity leaves little trace without maintenance. If digital records vanish, future observers may misjudge our scale entirely, which leads back to the deeper tension forming beneath every example. Civilization is not just infrastructure. It is continuity of practice. When practice stops, memory thins. When memory thins, scale shrinks. Göbekli Tepe teaches us that humans can intentionally end chapters of complexity. But it also suggests that once ended, complexity does not easily return. And that raises a sharper version of our central question. If modern civilization were forced into contraction through environmental pressure, systemic strain, or deliberate simplification, would we know what to carry forward? Or would we bury more than we intended? The most fragile part of civilization is not stone. It is belief. Göbekli Tepe was not a city. It was not residential. It appears to have been ceremonial, a place where groups gathered around carved pillars representing animals, forces, symbols we are still trying to decode. It required shared meaning. You do not move 20-ton stones for convenience. You move them for conviction. Conviction organizes labor. Conviction justifies effort. Conviction binds individuals into coordinated scale, and when conviction changes, scale shifts with it. The burial of Göbekli Tepe suggests that whatever worldview sustained those monumental gatherings transformed. The social glue evolved. Perhaps agriculture reorganized daily life around land ownership and inheritance. Perhaps smaller, localized shrines replaced central gathering sites. What is clear is that the old system no longer justified its own maintenance. This is not environmental drift. It is psychological drift. When belief weakens, institutions weaken. Consider how much of modern civilization rests on shared assumptions. That currency holds value, that institutions function, that tomorrow resembles today. These are not physical guarantees, they are collective agreements. Once those agreements erode, coordination narrows. A financial system collapses not only when numbers disappear, but when trust does. A political system destabilizes not only when laws change, but when legitimacy fractures. Göbekli Tepe shows us a prehistoric version of this phenomenon. The monument likely symbolized a worldview that unified groups beyond immediate survival needs. When that worldview shifted, the structure lost its function. The people did not forget how to carve stone overnight. They stopped needing to. That subtle distinction is critical. Collapse is often framed as incapacity, but sometimes it is reprioritization. When survival strategies change, symbolic infrastructure changes with them. In the transition from mobile hunter-gatherer societies to more settled agricultural communities, the scale of ritual coordination may have reduced. Smaller communities require smaller centers. Large ceremonial sites demand long-distance cooperation. Long-distance cooperation demands stable surplus. If surplus becomes uncertain, the cost of maintaining symbolic scale rises. So, scale contracts, not through violence, through recalibration. Now extend that lens forward. Modern civilization is built on belief in expansion. Growth models assume increase, markets assume progress. Education assumes upward mobility. What happens if that belief shifts? Not through catastrophe, through fatigue. If populations age, if growth slows, if optimism declines, do large-scale institutions retain their energy? History suggests that when collective vision narrows, so does coordination radius. The burial of Göbekli Tepe may represent the moment when a large-scale shared vision gave way to smaller, localized priorities. The monument did not collapse. It became irrelevant. Irrelevance is quieter than destruction, but equally transformative. Modern parallels are uncomfortable. Imagine global institutions slowly losing participation. International alliances weakening through apathy rather than conflict. Large infrastructure projects postponed indefinitely because enthusiasm wanes. Nothing explodes, nothing burns. Scale simply stops expanding. Then it shrinks. And shrinking can feel stable in the short term. Smaller commitments, reduced complexity, local focus. But over generations, the cumulative effect reduces civilizational ceiling. Göbekli Tepe forces us to confront a psychological dimension of contraction. Humans can choose to step away from complexity. We are not only victims of collapse, we are agents of it. If maintaining large-scale coordination feels too costly, emotionally, economically, or environmentally, societies can simplify deliberately, and simplification reduces resilience to large shocks, because resilience often depends on surplus complexity. A simplified system is easier to maintain but harder to scale rapidly in crisis. This duality is the tension beneath every example we have examined so far. The Bronze Age collapsed under systemic pressure. The Indus cities contracted under environmental drift. Göbekli Tepe was buried during social transformation. 3 different mechanisms, 1 consistent outcome: reduced scale. And we have still not answered the central question. If modern civilization experiences prolonged systemic stress, whether environmental, biological, economic, or psychological, how long before we too begin reducing scale? Not through dramatic collapse, through redefinition of priorities. The people who sealed Göbekli Tepe likely believed they were moving forward. From our vantage point, it looks like disappearance. Perspective changes everything. If future historians examine our era and see reduced global coordination, fragmented networks, and localized systems, they may describe it as contraction. We might describe it as sustainability. The boundary between adaptation and collapse is thin, and once crossed, it is rarely obvious in real time. Göbekli Tepe stands today because it was buried. It survived because it was ended. That paradox lingers. Sometimes preservation requires closure, but closure always carries loss. The question now deepens. If contraction becomes unavoidable, what would we choose to preserve? And what would we be willing to let go? When Europeans first entered the Amazon basin, they described endless forest. Vast, suffocating, primeval, a green world untouched by large civilization. For centuries, that description hardened into assumption. The soil was too poor, the climate too harsh, the jungle too dominant. The Amazon, it was said, could never support dense urban life. It was wilderness. But wilderness can be deceptive. Beneath that forest lies engineered soil, terra preta, dark, carbon-rich earth created deliberately by human hands. It regenerates fertility for centuries. It does not occur naturally at scale. It is manufactured through sustained human management. You do not create terra preta accidentally. You create it intentionally, generation after generation. Satellite imaging and archaeological surveys now reveal geometric earthworks hidden beneath canopy, raised agricultural fields, canal systems, causeways, structured settlement networks, entire landscapes reshaped without stone monuments. Estimates suggest that before European contact, the Amazon may have supported millions of people. Some researchers place the number as high as 10 million. 10 million people living in coordinated ecological systems, not cities of stone, but cities of biology. Agriculture interwoven with forest, waterways engineered for fish cultivation, soil chemistry manipulated to increase yield. This was a civilization that built with life rather than against it. And then it vanished. Not slowly over centuries, not through invasion, through microbes. Smallpox, measles, influenza. Pathogens carried unintentionally by Europeans traveled faster than armies ever could. Populations without prior exposure had no immunity. Mortality rates in some regions may have exceeded 70%. Entire communities collapsed within a few seasons. When population density drops abruptly, systems dependent on maintenance fail. Fields go untended. Canals clog. Engineered soil systems degrade. The forest does not conquer, it reclaims. Within decades, raised agricultural fields were swallowed by vegetation. Wooden architecture rotted, earthen structures eroded. Stone leaves ruins. Wood leaves memory. And memory fades. By the time later explorers moved deeper inland, they saw dense jungle and assumed it had always been that way. The absence of visible monuments became proof, incorrect proof, that no large civilization had ever existed. The Amazon case forces us to reconsider what collapse looks like. It can be biological, no siege, no political overthrow, just demographic subtraction. Remove enough people, and scale dissolves automatically. Civilization is not only infrastructure, it is maintenance. Without people maintaining complexity, complexity decays. Now consider how dependent modern civilization is on population density. Hospitals require trained staff. Power grids require technicians. Water treatment plants require constant oversight. If population density drops sharply through pandemic, demographic collapse, or prolonged instability, maintenance falters. When maintenance falters, infrastructure weakens. When infrastructure weakens, coordination shrinks. The Amazon example is especially unsettling because the collapse left almost no immediate trace. No towering ruins to mark former scale. Imagine if modern civilization contracted in a way that left little durable evidence. Digital data decays quickly without power. Cloud servers fail without cooling. Magnetic storage erodes. In 1,000 years, what remains? Concrete fragments, corroded steel, perhaps radioactive traces from energy production. But the software of civilization, its data, its coordination, its networks, would vanish far faster than stone. The Amazon shows that scale can be enormous and still disappear into ecological silence. And here lies a deeper vulnerability. Global connectivity accelerates biological spread. The same trade networks that increase prosperity also increase exposure. In the 16th century, microbial transfer was accidental and unrecognized. In the modern world, biological systems are monitored and studied, but speed remains a factor. Air travel moves pathogens across continents in hours. Urban density accelerates transmission. The more interconnected the network, the faster disruption propagates. The Amazonian societies were highly adapted to their environment. They engineered soil in ways modern scientists still study with admiration. Terra preta remains fertile centuries later because of deliberate carbon enrichment strategies. This was advanced ecological knowledge. Yet no ecological knowledge can prevent immune shock from novel pathogens. Biological collapse bypasses walls. It bypasses engineering. It bypasses political systems. It reduces scale by reducing people. And once people are gone, complexity thins. The forest reclaimed the Amazon not because it was stronger than civilization, but because civilization stopped maintaining the forest. That distinction matters. Nature does not defeat civilization. It simply waits. When human systems weaken, natural systems expand, which raises the question again, more quietly, more sharply. If modern civilization were to experience severe demographic contraction, how long would infrastructure persist without sustained human density? A year? 5 years? A generation? Would our cities hold without constant care? Or would vegetation creep through concrete, corrosion weaken bridges, and digital memory fade into unreadable fragments? The Amazon teaches us that Civilization built on living systems can vanish into apparent wilderness within decades, not because it failed intellectually, because it lost critical mass. Scale depends on numbers, and when numbers drop below maintenance threshold, contraction accelerates. We often think of collapse as the destruction of buildings, but it may be simpler than that. It may be the quiet disappearance of enough people that buildings no longer matter. There is a difference between being defeated and being outlasted. The Amazon was not conquered by a superior army. It was not technologically outclassed. The societies that shaped its soil understood ecology in ways that modern science is still decoding. Terra preta remains one of the most efficient long-term soil enhancement methods ever discovered. They understood carbon cycling. They understood nutrient retention. They understood how to grow food without stripping the land bare. In many ways, they were more sustainable than industrial agriculture. And yet, sustainability does not equal invulnerability. When disease removed a massive portion of the population, the systems that required human density began to fail. Raised fields are not self-operating. Canal systems do not dredge themselves. Managed forests revert without pruning, planting, and control. Biological civilization depends on continuous human touch. Once that touch disappears, nature does not hesitate. It fills the vacuum. And nature moves quietly. Roots crack through abandoned pathways. Vines climb over structures. Silt clogs waterways. Within a generation, landscapes can appear untouched. This is perhaps the most humbling lesson of the Amazon. Human systems feel permanent while they are active, but permanence depends on repetition. If repetition stops, decay begins immediately. Consider modern parallels. Our civilization is deeply dependent on constant input. Electricity must flow every second. Water must be treated continuously. Digital systems require cooling, updates, security patches. There is no pause button. If large-scale demographic loss occurred today, we would not see immediate apocalyptic collapse. For weeks, even months, systems might continue to operate. But without sufficient trained personnel, small failures accumulate. Power stations miss maintenance cycles. Software updates lapse. Supply chains falter due to missing logistics staff. Redundancy exists, but redundancy has limits. The Amazonian collapse demonstrates how quickly critical mass matters. A society of millions can sustain large-scale ecological engineering. A society reduced by half may struggle to maintain baseline complexity. A society reduced by 3/4 cannot sustain former scale. It reorganizes. This reorganization is not dramatic, it is practical. Survivors focus on immediate needs: food, water, shelter, security. Long-term ecological shaping becomes secondary, and when shaping stops, rewilding begins. Imagine modern metropolitan regions experiencing prolonged demographic decline. Buildings stand, but elevators fail without parts. Highways crack without repair. Bridges corrode. Not all at once, gradually. The visual change might lag behind systemic change. At first, it would look like temporary dysfunction. Then it would become normalized scarcity. What the Amazon reveals is that scale is maintained not by structures, but by density and coordination. Remove density, and coordination shrinks. Remove coordination, and complexity thins. And complexity thins faster than intuition suggests. There is another dimension to this example that deserves attention. The Amazonian societies were embedded within their ecosystem. They engineered the forest without destroying it. Their collapse, therefore, did not leave scars of stone or ash. It left absorption. Modern civilization is not embedded in the same way. It is extractive at scale. It builds with concrete, steel, synthetic materials. If contraction occurred today, the physical remnants would not dissolve as seamlessly. Industrial sites require monitoring long after abandonment. Energy infrastructure demands decommissioning procedures. Chemical plants require containment. We have created systems that cannot simply be left behind safely. That complicates contraction. The Amazon case was tragic but environmentally absorbable. Modern contraction could leave hazardous residue, which raises a deeper question. Have we built a civilization that can downscale safely? Or have we constructed systems that require perpetual growth to remain stable? Because perpetual growth is a fragile premise. Every example we have examined shows that civilizations eventually encounter limits: environmental, systemic, psychological, biological. The Amazon adds a critical dimension: biological vulnerability amplified by connectivity. In the 16th century, microbial transmission spread across continents without understanding. Today, we possess medical knowledge and surveillance networks, yet speed remains. Air travel moves pathogens globally within hours. Urban density accelerates transmission. Global trade networks spread biological risk alongside goods. Connectivity increases prosperity and exposure. The Amazonian societies had no immunity to foreign microbes. Modern populations have medicine, but systems are still strained by large-scale biological shock. If the demographic contraction reached a critical threshold, the maintenance burden of modern infrastructure could outpace available expertise, and when expertise fragments, coordination shrinks. Once coordination shrinks, scale contracts. Not because humanity disappears, because complexity exceeds manageable capacity. The forest swallowed Amazonian civilization within decades because human hands stopped shaping it. What would swallow ours? Rust, vegetation, data decay, or perhaps fragmentation into smaller localized systems that no longer resemble global synchronization? The Amazon example reinforces something we are slowly uncovering across all cases. Civilization is not a fortress. It is a process. Processes require participation. When participation falls below threshold, the process changes. The forest did not conquer. It inherited. Which brings the central question back into focus, heavier now. If our population density, trust networks, or institutional continuity falter significantly, how long before our systems become too large to maintain at current scale? And when they do, will contraction feel like collapse? Or simply like the new normal? There is a pattern emerging beneath every example we've examined. The Bronze Age did not collapse because people forgot how to build. The Indus cities did not vanish because their engineers were incompetent. The Amazon did not disappear because it lacked sophistication. Göbekli Tepe was not erased by ignorance. In every case, complexity existed. In every case, scale was real. And in every case, scale contracted. Not always violently, not always dramatically, but consistently. So we have to ask something uncomfortable. What is it about scale itself that becomes dangerous? Expansion feels like strength. A growing empire, a growing network, a growing economy. Expansion means more trade, more specialization, more coordination. But expansion also means more dependency. The larger the system, the more nodes must function simultaneously. A small settlement can survive isolation. A global civilization cannot. Think about the modern electrical grid. It spans regions, sometimes continents. Power generation depends on fuel extraction. Fuel extraction depends on transport. Transport depends on digital coordination. Digital coordination depends on electricity. It is a loop. Remove one element long enough and the loop destabilizes. We call this efficiency, but efficiency often eliminates redundancy. Redundancy is expensive. It means having backup systems that may never be used. It means stockpiling resources. It means accepting short-term inefficiency for long-term resilience. Modern civilization is optimized heavily for efficiency. Just-in-time manufacturing, Lean supply chains, globalized specialization. This model creates immense prosperity under stable conditions, but it narrows the margin for prolonged disruption. The Bronze Age depended on tin moving across thousands of miles. The Indus cities depended on stable hydrology. The Amazon depended on population density. We depend on synchronized energy, digital continuity, and global coordination. Expansion increases output. It also increases exposure. A drought in one region of the Bronze Age world rippled outward through trade networks. A shifting river weakened urban density in the Indus. A virus introduced through contact collapsed Amazonian scale. In each case, interconnectedness amplified impact. Connectivity is multiplier. Multiplier of prosperity. Multiplier of vulnerability. Now consider modern expansion in biological terms. Air travel connects cities within hours. Financial markets synchronize instantly. Supply chains span continents. The system moves faster than any ancient civilization ever could. Speed creates advantage. Speed also reduces reaction time. When a disturbance enters a slow system, it spreads gradually. There is time to adapt. When disturbance enters a high-speed system, it cascades. Financial crises propagate globally within days. Supply chain disruptions ripple across industries in weeks. Information spreads across populations in seconds. Speed compresses response windows. The larger and faster the system, the thinner the margin for error. This is the paradox of expansion. Growth feels like security, but growth can harden dependency. A small agrarian community can endure isolation because it produces locally. A metropolis dependent on imported food cannot. We often measure strength in scale, population size, GDP, infrastructure volume. But perhaps resilience is not proportional to size. Perhaps resilience is proportional to adaptability. And adaptability decreases as systems become rigidly optimized. The Indus grid worked beautifully until the river shifted. The Bronze trade network functioned until supply fractured. The Amazon ecosystem thrived until population density collapsed. None of those systems were irrational. They were optimized for prevailing conditions. The danger lies in assuming prevailing conditions are permanent. Modern civilization assumes energy continuity. It assumes climate stability within predictable bands. It assumes political cooperation sufficient to maintain global trade. These assumptions are not absurd. They are practical, but they are assumptions. History shows that when foundational assumptions shift, contraction follows. And contraction does not require universal catastrophe. It requires sustained misalignment. If maintaining global synchronization becomes too costly relative to benefit, fragmentation becomes logical. Regional supply chains replace global ones. Local energy systems replace centralized grids. National priorities override international cooperation. Each step feels protective, yet each step reduces scale. Reduced scale reduces specialization. Reduced specialization reduces complexity ceiling. And complexity once lost is not easily rebuilt. We are now approaching the psychological threshold of the central question. If expansion creates fragility, and fragility increases with speed and interdependence, then how long can a system optimized for growth remain stable under sustained pressure? Not pressure dramatic enough to make headlines, just enough pressure to force recalculation. The Bronze Age recalculated under trade disruption. The Indus recalculated under hydrological shift. The Amazon recalculated under demographic collapse. Each recalculation resulted in smaller coordination radius. None of those societies believed they were stepping backward. They believed they were adapting. Adaptation downward is still contraction, and contraction is often permanent within a generational timescale. The expansion that builds greatness also builds fragility. which means the most important question may not be whether civilization collapses in fire, but whether it gradually simplifies under pressure until it no longer resembles its former scale. If that process began today, would we recognize it? Or would we call it efficiency, reform, sustainability, until one day we realized the crest had already passed? There is a threshold every complex system eventually reaches. Before that threshold, growth creates strength. After that threshold, growth creates fragility. The transition is rarely visible in real time. Modern civilization operates at a level of complexity no previous society has achieved. Energy grids spanning continents, financial systems moving trillions in milliseconds, supply chains that depend on synchronized production across oceans. We interpret this as control. But control at scale requires constant balance. Balance between redundancy and efficiency, balance between speed and stability, balance between centralization and flexibility. The more centralized the system, the more catastrophic a central failure becomes. Consider food. In ancient villages, food was local. Harvest failed and the village suffered, but the radius of impact was limited. In modern society, food systems are global. Grain grown in one continent feeds another. Fertilizers are synthesized using energy extracted elsewhere. Distribution depends on trucking, shipping, refrigeration, and digital logistics. Under stable conditions, this creates abundance. Under disruption, it creates exposure. If fertilizer supply tightens, agricultural yield drops. If fuel distribution falters, transport slows. If digital systems fail, routing collapses. Each node is linked to another. The system works beautifully when synchronized, but synchronization is brittle. The Bronze Age world synchronized metal supply and trade. The Indus synchronized water and urban planning. The Amazon synchronized ecology and population density. Each reached a level where small sustained disturbances triggered cascading adjustments. Now consider modern digital dependency. We store memory in servers. We coordinate commerce through algorithms. We rely on continuous electricity to access information. If digital continuity were disrupted long enough, not days but months, how many skills would degrade? Would financial markets revert to slower mechanisms? Would global communication fragment into regional networks? Would trust in digital systems erode permanently? Complex systems degrade unevenly. Some parts fail quickly, others linger. After the Bronze Age collapse, some regions retained fragments of literacy while others lost it entirely. Knowledge did not disappear uniformly. It fractured. Fracture is different from collapse. Fracture creates pockets of capability separated by distance and distrust. If modern systems fractured, some regions might maintain high complexity while others simplify. Over time, divergence increases. Shared standards weaken. Global coordination becomes regional negotiation. The world shrinks, not physically, but functionally. There is another layer to this threshold. Complexity requires trust. Trust that contracts will be honored. Trust that infrastructure will function. Trust that tomorrow resembles today closely enough to plan. When trust erodes, systems narrow. People hoard rather than trade. Regions prioritize autonomy over integration. Institutions guard resources instead of sharing them. The contraction begins psychologically before it becomes structural. The burial of Göbekli Tepe was likely preceded by belief shift. The Indus contraction likely began with environmental doubt. The Amazon collapse followed demographic trauma that shattered continuity. In each case, trust in scale weakened. Once trust weakens, coordination tightens inward. Modern civilization has placed enormous trust in perpetual expansion. Growth models assume increasing consumption. Financial systems assume increasing output. Energy systems assume continuous extraction. If growth stalls long enough, the assumptions behind those systems strain. And when assumptions strain, contraction is framed as necessity. A reduction in global trade becomes strategic autonomy. Energy decentralization becomes resilience. Population decline becomes demographic transition. Each term may be rational, but taken together they indicate reduced scale. Reduced scale reduces specialization. Reduced specialization reduces innovation capacity. And innovation is what modern civilization depends on to solve emerging problems. Here lies the paradox. We rely on increasing complexity to solve problems created by increasing complexity. Energy challenges require advanced engineering. Climate challenges require global coordination. Biological threats require rapid scientific response. If complexity shrinks, our capacity to respond shrinks with it. The threshold between strength and fragility is crossed quietly. At first, optimization feels like progress. Supply chains become leaner, institutions become more centralized, redundancies are removed to increase efficiency. But redundancy is what absorbs shock. When shock comes, lean systems strain. If strain persists, systems simplify, and simplification can feel stabilizing in the short term. Local food production reduces dependency. Regional energy grids increase autonomy. National supply chains reduce exposure. But each simplification reduces global synchronization. The world becomes less interdependent and less capable of coordinated response at planetary scale. We return to the same tension emerging across history. Expansion creates greatness. Expansion also creates exposure. When exposure meets sustained pressure, contraction begins. The question is no longer whether contraction is possible. History shows it is. The question is how fast it unfolds in a system moving at digital speed. Would it take decades, as in the Bronze Age? Generations, as in the Indus? Or could modern contraction accelerate because of the very speed we celebrate? Speed magnifies prosperity. Speed magnifies collapse. And once contraction begins, rebuilding scale is far more difficult than expanding it ever was. Because rebuilding requires trust restored, surplus regained, coordination reestablished. None of those emerge quickly. So the central question grows heavier with each example. If modern civilization crosses its threshold from strength to fragility, how long before we realize we are no longer expanding, but quietly simplifying? Every civilization that has ever fallen believed it was stable the year before it wasn't. That is not arrogance. It is human nature. Stability feels permanent while it is functioning. Systems that have operated reliably for decades create psychological certainty. Markets fluctuate but recover. Governments struggle but persist. Infrastructure strains but holds. The longer a system survives stress, the stronger the illusion becomes that it can survive any stress. This illusion is powerful. It allows long-term planning. It encourages investment. It sustains trust across distance. But it also dulls sensitivity to gradual drift. The Bronze Age kingdoms exchanged diplomatic letters expressing confidence in alliances, right up until those alliances could no longer deliver aid. The Indus cities maintained urban grids even as environmental patterns shifted beneath them. Amazonian societies thrived in ecological integration until pathogens fractured demographic continuity. In each case, collapse was not preceded by public acknowledgement of fragility. Confidence persisted longer than the foundations that supported it. Modern civilization rests on layered confidence. Confidence in energy continuity, confidence in global financial stability, confidence in medical systems, confidence in technological problem solving. These layers reinforce one another. When one layer cracks, others compensate. But what happens when multiple layers strain simultaneously? Psychological stability erodes before structural collapse becomes visible. People begin to question long-term assumptions. Is global trade reliable? Is energy affordable? Is institutional authority trustworthy? When doubt spreads, behavior shifts, investment narrows, risk tolerance declines. Communities prioritize local resilience over global participation. These shifts may appear prudent. They may indeed be prudent. But collectively, they reduce coordination scale. Coordination depends on shared belief in the system. If belief fragments, coordination fragments. The most fragile component of civilization is not infrastructure. It is expectation. Expectation that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to justify complex commitments. When expectation fractures, complexity shrinks. Consider financial systems. They function because participants believe contracts will be honored and value will persist. If confidence erodes deeply, markets freeze. Not because assets disappear, but because trust does. Trust cannot be legislated into existence. It must be experienced. In historical collapses, trust eroded unevenly. Some regions stabilized faster. Others remained fragmented for generations. Modern systems are faster and more tightly coupled. If confidence weakens in one major node, energy markets, financial hubs, political institutions, the ripple spreads instantly. Information velocity accelerates perception, and perception drives behavior. Behavior drives system stability. This feedback loop can amplify fragility. The psychological turn often precedes material contraction. Before cities thin, belief thins. Before trade shrinks, optimism shrinks. Before specialization declines, investment in specialization declines. Humans adapt to uncertainty by simplifying commitments. Simplification reduces exposure, but simplification at scale reduces complexity. The Bronze Age collapse likely felt at first like temporary disruption. The Indus contraction likely felt like adaptation to new rainfall patterns. The Amazonian disappearance likely felt like catastrophic tragedy. But the ecological reversion that followed became normalized quickly among survivors. Normalization is powerful. What begins as emergency becomes routine, and routine defines civilization. If modern societies experience sustained systemic stress, energy volatility, environmental instability, demographic shifts, the psychological adaptation may precede visible collapse. People recalibrate expectations downward. Long-term projects are postponed. Infrastructure investment slows. International cooperation narrows to short-term interests. Each adjustment may be rational, but the cumulative effect is contraction. Civilization does not require universal panic to shrink. It requires prolonged recalibration. Confidence erodes slowly until the horizon shortens. When the horizon shortens, complexity suffers. Complex systems require long planning horizons. Energy infrastructure spans decades. Urban development spans generations. Scientific research depends on stable funding over years. If uncertainty compresses planning horizons to months instead of decades, scale declines naturally. No dramatic collapse is required, just shortened vision. The psychological threshold is subtle. It is crossed when societies begin prioritizing preservation over expansion. Preservation can be wise, but if preservation becomes defensive isolation, coordination radius narrows. And once coordination radius narrows, rebuilding broader integration requires renewed confidence. Confidence is harder to rebuild than infrastructure. Bridges can be reconstructed. Trust must be re-earned. History suggests that after major contractions, rebuilding scale takes generations. Not because knowledge vanished entirely, but because confidence did. The central question now deepens further. If modern civilization faces sustained stress, will psychological contraction precede structural contraction? Will we simplify commitments before infrastructure fails? And if we do, will we recognize the shift as prudent adaptation Or will we only see it in hindsight as the moment the crest began to fall? Civilization is sustained not only by systems, but by belief in those systems. When belief cracks, structure follows. There is a quiet difference between fragile systems and stable ones. Fragile systems perform brilliantly under ideal conditions. Stable systems perform reliably under imperfect ones. The two are not the same. A fragile system maximizes output. A stable system maximizes endurance. For most of human history, endurance was the priority. Communities built within environmental limits because exceeding those limits meant starvation. Scale remained constrained by what could be maintained locally. Modern civilization reversed that equation. Energy density increased. Fossil fuels multiplied productivity. Transportation compressed distance. Digital networks erased communication lag. For the first time, human civilization operated beyond immediate ecological feedback loops. Output soared, but with output came interdependence at unprecedented levels. Interdependence increases prosperity, but it reduces autonomy. In the Bronze Age, trade networks enhanced strength but introduced vulnerability to distant disruption. In the Indus Valley, urban planning enhanced sanitation but depended on stable water patterns. In the Amazon, ecological integration enhanced productivity but depended on sustained human density. Every system that scales increases dependency on underlying stability. Fragility emerges not from weakness but from tight coupling. Tight coupling means one part cannot fail without affecting others. Consider electricity. Electricity powers water purification. Water purification supports population density. Population density sustains economic activity. Economic activity funds infrastructure maintenance. Each element reinforces the next. Under stable conditions, the loop sustains itself. Under sustained stress, failure in one node stresses all others simultaneously. Stable systems allow partial failure without total cascade. Fragile systems amplify partial failure. Ancient village societies were limited in scale, but partial failure rarely spread far. Modern civilization is expansive, but partial failure can ripple globally. The paradox is that our greatest strength, global synchronization, is also our greatest exposure. Synchronization eliminates delay. Eliminating delay eliminates buffering time. Buffering time is what allows adaptation. Without buffering time, adaptation must be immediate, or contraction begins. We often assume that advanced technology increases stability. In reality, it often increases sensitivity. Highly optimized systems have narrow operating tolerances. Power grids require frequency precision. Financial systems require liquidity confidence. Supply chains require synchronized scheduling. Small deviations can trigger large responses. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means stability requires active management of fragility. History shows that fragility is rarely addressed until after contraction begins. The Bronze Age kingdoms did not anticipate simultaneous trade, climate, and migration stress. The Indus did not design cities expecting river systems to shift beyond adaptation. Amazonian societies did not foresee microbial exposure through contact networks. Each system functioned brilliantly within its expected parameters. The danger arises when parameters change faster than systems adapt. Modern civilization assumes continuous energy availability. If energy transitions become strained or volatile, every dependent system feels pressure. Modern civilization assumes digital continuity. If cyber disruption or infrastructure breakdown interrupts digital systems long enough, coordination falters. Modern civilization assumes institutional continuity. If political fragmentation deepens globally, cooperation narrows. None of these pressures alone guarantee collapse, but layered together over time, they test the difference between fragile and stable. Stability is not the absence of stress. It is the capacity to absorb stress without shrinking. The examples we have examined show a common pattern. When stress exceeded absorption capacity, scale contracted. The Bronze Age did not disappear, but trade networks shrank. The Indus civilization did not vanish, but urban density declined. The Amazon did not empty completely, but large-scale ecological coordination ceased. Humanity endured. Complexity narrowed. This distinction is crucial. The central question is not whether humans survive. Humans almost always survive. The question is whether modern scale survives prolonged stress. Scale requires surplus of energy, surplus of trust, surplus of coordination. If surplus narrows, scale narrows. Stability is achieved when surplus margins are wide enough to absorb sustained disturbance. Fragility emerges when margins thin in pursuit of efficiency. We celebrate lean systems because they reduce cost, but lean systems reduce slack. Slack absorbs shock. Without slack, adaptation becomes contraction. The psychological dimension intersects here. If societies perceive fragility, they often respond by simplifying, localizing supply chains, reducing external commitments, narrowing integration. These steps may increase local stability but decrease global scale. Global scale is what defines modern civilization. If scale reduces, specialization reduces. If specialization reduces, innovation slows. If innovation slows, problem-solving capacity declines. And declining problem-solving capacity further reduces surplus. This feedback loop is subtle. It does not produce headlines immediately. It produces gradual simplification. And simplification feels stable until a larger shock arrives. Stable systems are not those that avoid stress. They are those that maintain complexity despite stress. The question we must now confront is whether modern civilization has built enough slack into its architecture to remain stable under layered pressures, or whether we have optimized so tightly that prolonged disturbance would force contraction. History suggests that when complexity tightens beyond adaptability, contraction becomes the default outcome. The difference between fragile and stable is not visible during prosperity. It is revealed under pressure. We are living in a civilization of unprecedented complexity. The question is not whether complexity is impressive. It is whether it is absorbent. And if it is not, how long before contraction begins? Not through fire, not through invasion, but through the quiet narrowing of scale. At this point, a reasonable objection rises. We are not the Bronze Age. We are not the Indus Valley. We are not pre-agricultural ritual builders. We are not isolated ecological societies vulnerable to first contact disease. We have science. We have global communication. We have historical awareness. We study collapse. Surely that makes us different. It is a fair argument. Modern civilization has advantages no previous society possessed. We can model climate patterns with satellites. We can sequence pathogens in days. We can transmit information instantly across the planet. We have diversified energy sources. We have institutional memory stored in unprecedented volume. But every civilization in history believed it possessed unique advantages. The Bronze Age kingdoms believed their alliances ensured stability. The Indus cities believed their engineered grids ensured sanitation and order. Amazonian societies believed their ecological integration ensured sustainability. They were not irrational. Their systems functioned until they didn't. The uncomfortable question is not whether we are more advanced. We are. The uncomfortable question is whether advancement removes cyclic vulnerability or simply changes its form. There is no doubt that modern science increases problem-solving capacity. But science itself depends on stability. Research requires funding continuity. Institutions require political trust. Global collaboration requires diplomatic stability. If systemic stress reduces surplus, research budgets narrow. If political polarization intensifies, institutional legitimacy weakens. If geopolitical fragmentation rises, collaboration slows. None of this implies imminent collapse. It implies conditional resilience. Our resilience is contingent on sustained coordination. The deeper difference between ancient civilizations and ours is speed. Information moves faster. Capital moves faster. Goods move faster. Pathogens move faster. Speed magnifies response capacity, but also magnifies cascade potential. If disruption propagates faster than adaptation, scale compresses more quickly than in slower systems. The Bronze Age collapse unfolded across decades. The Indus contraction spanned generations. The Amazon demographic collapse accelerated within a century. Modern systems operate at digital tempo. Financial shock can circle the globe in hours. Supply chain disruption can halt industries in weeks. Public perception can shift overnight. Speed reduces buffer time. Buffer time is what allows course correction before contraction becomes irreversible. The question returns, unavoidable now. If the global grid failed tomorrow and did not recover quickly, how long before contraction begins? Not extinction, contraction. Days before distribution falters, weeks before supply chains seize, months before specialized systems degrade, years before expertise erodes through lack of practice, generations before normalized simplicity replaces remembered complexity. The process would not be uniform. Some regions would stabilize faster, others would fragment. We might see pockets of advanced functionality coexisting with simplified zones. This uneven contraction would complicate recovery. Shared standards would weaken. Interoperability would decline. Trust across regions would narrow. Rebuilding global synchronization would require renewed surplus, energy, trust, coordination. History suggests that once scale contracts significantly, rebuilding it takes far longer than maintaining it ever did. That is not pessimism. It is pattern recognition. Are we an exception? Perhaps partially. Our knowledge base is broader, our energy capacity larger, our tools more precise. But knowledge alone does not guarantee continuity. Knowledge requires transmission. Transmission requires stability. If stability falters long enough, transmission fragments. Fragments persist. But fragments are not the same as integrated complexity. The Roman Empire did not vanish entirely. Roads remained. Legal principles endured. Cultural memory survived in altered form. But the scale of imperial coordination disappeared. Medieval Europe was not ignorant. It was decentralized. Scale had contracted. Rebuilding continental integration took centuries. So the core question tightens once more. If our civilization faces sustained systemic stress, energy volatility, environmental drift, institutional fragmentation, how long before contraction becomes normalized? And if contraction normalizes, would we even attempt to rebuild previous scale? Or would we redefine success as local stability rather than global integration? The answer is not predetermined, but history offers no example of permanent exemption from cyclic pressure. Every complex society operates within constraints. When constraints shift, adaptation follows. Sometimes adaptation preserves scale, sometimes it reduces it. We have not yet answered whether we are immune, but the evidence suggests immunity is rare. The final question now becomes less abstract. If contraction begins, not through fire, not through invasion, but through cumulative strain, will we recognize it while it is happening? Or will future historians look back at our era and mark this moment as the crest before the turn? There is one illusion every civilization shares, that it has finally stabilized the human condition. The Romans believed their roads and law had created lasting order. The Qing believed their bureaucracy anchored continuity. The British Empire believed naval supremacy guaranteed permanence. Industrial Europe believed mechanization ensured unstoppable progress. Each era felt structurally different from what came before it. And in many ways, it was. Modern civilization feels even more different. We map the planet in real time. We monitor storms from space. We communicate instantly across oceans. We understand microbiology, nuclear physics, climate modeling. We are aware of past collapses. Surely that awareness grants immunity. But awareness does not eliminate constraint. The Bronze Age elites understood trade dependencies. They negotiated treaties precisely because they recognized interdependence. The Indus planners understood water management deeply enough to build complex drainage systems. The Amazonian societies understood ecological balance profoundly enough to engineer fertile soils for centuries. They were not unaware. They were embedded in systems that functioned until systemic conditions shifted beyond their design tolerance. The illusion of permanence does not arise from ignorance. It arises from success. When a system works long enough, confidence solidifies into expectation. Expectation becomes identity. We are the technological civilization. We are the global civilization. We are the advanced civilization. Identity shapes perception. Perception shapes response. If stress is interpreted as temporary anomaly, response remains incremental. If stress is interpreted as structural shift, response becomes transformative. Most societies interpret early stress as anomaly. The Bronze Age kingdoms likely saw trade disruptions as temporary instability. The Indus cities likely saw shifting water patterns as cyclical fluctuation. The Amazonian populations likely saw disease at first as localized tragedy. By the time structural recognition emerged, scale had already contracted. Modern civilization confronts layered pressures simultaneously. Energy transition complexity, climate volatility, geopolitical fragmentation, demographic aging in many regions, digital vulnerability. None individually signal inevitable collapse. Together, they increase systemic load. Load is manageable when slack exists. When slack narrows, load accumulates. Slack can be economic surplus. Slack can be political trust. Slack can be demographic vitality. If slack shrinks across multiple domains simultaneously, adaptation becomes harder. The illusion of permanence encourages delay and structural adaptation. Delay reduces options. Once options narrow, contraction may become the least disruptive path. History suggests that contraction is rarely planned explicitly. It emerges through cumulative decisions made under constraint. Reduce foreign commitments. Prioritize domestic stability. Scale back ambitious infrastructure. Focus on local resilience. Each decision appears prudent. Collectively, they reduce coordination radius. Coordination radius defines scale. When coordination radius shrinks, civilization simplifies. Simplification is not inherently negative. It can increase short-term resilience, but simplification also reduces capacity for global coordination. If global problems persist, climate, biological risk, resource competition, reduced global coordination increases vulnerability to those very pressures. The paradox becomes clear. The measures taken to preserve stability locally may erode stability globally. Over time, global synchronization weakens. Trade networks regionalize. Energy systems localize. Political alliances narrow. None of this feels like collapse. It feels like recalibration. But recalibration downward remains contraction. The final illusion is that modern civilization is too interconnected to fragment. Interconnection does not guarantee cohesion. It increases dependency. Dependency under strain can fracture. The question we have carried from the beginning now stands fully formed. If the global systems we depend on falter, not instantly but under prolonged strain, how long before contraction becomes visible? And more importantly, would we resist contraction or rationalize it? History shows that permanence is rarely permanent. Not because civilizations lack intelligence, but because intelligence operates within constraint. Constraint shifts. Systems either adapt at equal speed or simplify. We may be more advanced than any civilization before us, but advancement changes the scale of vulnerability. It does not erase it. The illusion of permanence is comforting, but comfort does not alter physics, ecology, or human psychology. The crust always feels steady until gravity reasserts itself, and gravity in history has never been repealed. Let's return to the question we have avoided answering directly. If the grid went down tomorrow, not for hours, not for days, but permanently, how long before modern civilization contracts? Not humanity, civilization at scale. The first 24 hours would feel chaotic but survivable. Backup generators would engage, emergency services would activate protocols, governments would issue statements. Most people would assume restoration was imminent. The first week would introduce friction. Fuel shortages would emerge as pumps fail. Supply trucks would stall without digital routing. Grocery shelves would empty in urban centers. Communication networks would degrade as battery backups drain, but society would still feel intact. The first month would test coordination. Hospitals without sustained power would triage aggressively. Refrigeration failures would compromise food storage. Water treatment plants would struggle. Urban sanitation would degrade. Confidence would begin to crack. Markets would be irrelevant without digital systems. Electronic banking would halt. Cash reserves would matter briefly until supply networks failed to restock goods. Local communities would begin organizing autonomously. At this stage, contraction would not yet be visible globally. It would feel like emergency stabilization. 6 months in, specialization would begin eroding. Semiconductor fabrication requires uninterrupted precision environments. Without stable energy and supply chains, advanced chip production would halt. Pharmaceutical production would decline as global chemical precursors become inaccessible. Air travel would largely cease. International trade would fragment. The world would not end, but global synchronization would. 1 year in, expertise would begin decaying through non-practice. Complex surgical procedures would become rarer without specialized equipment and supply chains. Software systems dependent on constant updates would degrade. Maintenance cycles missed repeatedly would compound infrastructure fragility. Urban density would become increasingly difficult to sustain. Migration outward from megacities would accelerate. Not because cities are unlivable immediately, but because sustaining them without large-scale energy becomes inefficient. 5 years in, generational memory would begin shifting. Children born after the event would not experience global digital connectivity as normal. Their baseline expectation would differ. Specializations dependent on high energy density would be rare or extinct. Local manufacturing might stabilize in certain regions. Regional coordination networks might re-emerge, but planetary synchronization would be gone. 10 years in, the world would look stable, but smaller. Less interconnected, less specialized, less technologically layered. Humanity would endure, but scale would have contracted. The question is not whether this scenario is likely tomorrow. The question is whether modern complexity could survive prolonged interruption without contraction. History suggests that once coordination radius shrinks, rebuilding global integration is slow. Rebuilding requires surplus of energy, surplus of trust, surplus of institutional continuity. Without those, stabilization occurs at reduced scale. The Bronze Age collapse did not eliminate agriculture. It reduced international trade. The Indus contraction did not eliminate community, it reduced urban density. The Amazonian collapse did not eliminate humanity. It reduced population below ecological maintenance threshold. In each case, survival continued, complexity narrowed. The hypothetical grid failure illustrates something uncomfortable. Modern civilization is not binary, on or off. It is layered. Remove energy continuity and digital systems fail first. Remove digital systems and financial coordination fails. Remove financial coordination and supply chains falter. Remove supply chains and specialization thins. Each layer depends on the previous. The deeper the dependency chain, the faster upper layers collapse when base layers weaken. The most difficult phase would not be the first month, it would be the second year. The moment when it becomes clear that restoration is not imminent. That is when psychological contraction begins. Expectations reset. Global ambition narrows to regional survival. Large-scale projects are abandoned. And once abandoned long enough, expertise tied to them fades. Rebuilding after prolonged contraction would require rediscovering not just technical knowledge, but institutional coherence that takes generations. The final answer to our question is not a number of days. It is a process. Contraction begins quickly under sustained interruption. Normalization of reduced scale happens within one generation, and once normalized, complexity ceiling lowers. The lesson from history is not inevitability. It is conditional endurance. Civilizations endure when they maintain surplus and adaptability. They contract when sustained pressure exceeds slack. If modern civilization retains sufficient slack, it stabilizes. If slack narrows too far, contraction follows. Not dramatically, not with cinematic collapse, but through quiet simplification. The lights going out would not return us to the Stone Age overnight. But within a generation, the world might look less like global synchronization and more like a mosaic of localized systems, remembering a larger world that once was. And that is the answer history keeps whispering. Not extinction, contraction. Now, shift perspective. Imagine it is 1,000 years from now. Our global civilization is either endured or contracted. Either way, centuries have passed. Climate patterns have shifted further. Coastlines have adjusted. Cities have risen or fallen. A future archaeologist stands over the remains of what was once a major metropolitan region. What survives? Concrete foundations, corroded steel frameworks, fragments of plastic embedded in sediment layers, perhaps traces of rare earth elements dispersed through soil. What does not survive? Cloud storage, digital archives, encrypted financial systems. The daily flow of data that defined our era. Most of modern civilization is not carved into stone. It is encoded in electricity. Electricity leaves no durable monument. If contraction occurred, even partial contraction, how much of our intellectual scale would remain legible to distant observers? Would they see us as advanced? Or would they see scattered infrastructure and assume limited sophistication? The Amazon case already warns us. Absence of visible monuments can mask enormous complexity. If maintenance stops, systems decay rapidly. Bridges collapse without inspection. Tunnels flood without pumping. High-rise buildings weaken without repair. Within centuries, much of what feels permanent becomes rubble, indistinguishable from geological debris. Consider nuclear facilities. They require monitoring long after active use. Without oversight, containment systems degrade. Some sites might remain hazardous markers in the sediment record, thin radioactive signatures that signal high-energy civilization once existed. But would those signatures communicate our scale of coordination, or merely our capacity for concentrated power? Future archaeologists might find isolated pockets of preserved technology, sealed vaults, protected archives, durable materials. But integration is harder to preserve than fragments. Integration is what defines modern civilization. We do not merely possess advanced tools. We synchronize them across continents. That synchronization is invisible without active operation. Once the process stops, the artifact remains, but the system is gone. A Roman road still communicates engineering intent. A fiber optic cable does not communicate the network it once supported. This distinction matters. If contraction occurred gradually rather than catastrophically, certain regions might retain advanced systems longer than others. A patchwork world could emerge. Some zones maintaining energy-intensive infrastructure, others stabilizing at lower complexity. Over centuries, divergence would widen. Knowledge could persist unevenly. Localized centers of expertise might survive, but without global synchronization, innovation speed would slow. Historical precedent suggests that after large-scale contraction, rebuilding continental integration takes generations, sometimes centuries. Medieval Europe inherited Roman infrastructure, but not Roman scale. The knowledge of concrete and aqueduct engineering survived in fragments, but imperial synchronization did not. Reconstruction of large-scale integration required renewed surplus, trust, and coordination, and those do not reappear overnight. Now imagine future observers examining our era through sediment layers. They would see a sharp spike in energy use, a layer rich in industrial residue, a rapid expansion of infrastructure across the globe within a few centuries, geologically instantaneous. Then what? If our scale continues, perhaps a sustained plateau of complexity follows. If contraction occurs, they might see a peak followed by fragmentation. Reduced industrial output, localized materials, less global uniformity in artifacts. The pattern would resemble earlier cycles: rise, peak, contraction. The difference is magnitude. No civilization before ours operated at planetary scale, which makes the stakes larger. If contraction occurs at planetary scale, rebuilding planetary integration becomes exponentially harder, because the system would have to regenerate across a wider base with more complex dependencies. The question that began this journey now returns with final clarity. Are we an exception to historical cycles, or the largest example of them? If the answer is exception, then our scale continues, adapts, and stabilizes under pressure. If the answer is pattern, then sustained stress produces contraction, not necessarily collapse into darkness, but simplification into something smaller. Humanity would endure either way. But endurance is not the same as scale. Future archaeologists might look at our remnants and debate whether we were a brief flare of complexity or the foundation of something longer. They might marvel at our energy spike and wonder why it plateaued. They might reconstruct fragments of digital storage and realize how much was lost when continuity broke. Or they might see continuity sustained and mark this era as the moment humanity stabilized at planetary scale. We stand at the crest without knowing which outcome defines us. History does not guarantee collapse. It guarantees pressure. Pressure reveals whether systems absorb or contract. The past offers no immunity. It offers pattern. The question is no longer abstract. If global synchronization falters under sustained strain, how much of our scale survives? And if future generations inherit a simpler world, will they see it as decline or simply as normal? Civilization is not a monument. It is a process maintained by belief, energy, coordination, and continuity. When those align, scale grows. When they misalign, scale narrows. And from the outside, centuries later, it always looks inevitable. Strip away the monuments, strip away the satellites, strip away the data centers humming in desert air, strip away the global trade routes and the synchronized markets. What remains? Not the system, the human. History's quiet lesson is not that civilizations die. It is that humans adapt after they do. The Bronze Age world fractured, but farming continued. The Indus cities thinned, but families persisted. The Amazonian networks dissolved, but survivors reorganized. Göbekli Tepe was buried, but belief reshaped itself elsewhere. Scale changes. The human condition does not. We gather. We cooperate. We compete. We tell stories to make sense of pressure. Civilization at planetary scale is new. Human adaptation is ancient. If the lights went out tomorrow and never returned at full strength, humanity would not return to caves. It would reorganize around what is possible. Energy would localize, trade would regionalize, institutions would simplify. The world would not end, it would shrink. And shrinking is not the same as extinction. It is compression. Compression of ambition, compression of coordination, compression of expectation. The question that began this journey was never truly about technology. It was about scale. How long before we contract? The answer is not a number. It is a threshold. As long as surplus exceeds strain, scale expands or stabilizes. When strain exceeds surplus long enough, scale narrows. The narrowing can be slow or fast, but it is rarely dramatic in the way movies portray. It feels like adaptation. People focus on food, family, safety. Grand global projects fade into background memory. Future generations grow up with smaller horizons and call them normal. That is the quiet transformation history repeats. We fear collapse as annihilation. History suggests contraction is more common, and contraction is survivable. What does not always survive is synchronization across vast distance. The Roman Empire synchronized roads, law, currency across continents. After contraction, those networks fractured. Medieval societies functioned, but locally. It took centuries to rebuild large-scale integration. Not because humans lost intelligence, because rebuilding scale requires trust across distance. Trust takes time. Time requires stability. Stability requires surplus. It is a delicate chain. We often ask whether modern civilization could fall. The more precise question is whether it could sustain global integration under prolonged strain. Integration is expensive. It requires constant energy input, constant political negotiation, constant infrastructure renewal. When those inputs become strained, contraction becomes efficient. Efficient, but smaller. If future historians examine our era, they may see a peak of energy density and coordination unprecedented in human history. They may see a branching path. Either we stabilized at planetary scale, solving energy transitions, maintaining trust networks, adapting infrastructure fast enough to match environmental drift, or we simplified into a mosaic of regions, each stable in its own way but no longer globally synchronized. Both outcomes are human. Both are survivable. Only one preserves the scale we currently take for granted. The final image is not of burning cities. It is quieter. A child born into a world with fewer satellites overhead, fewer flights crossing oceans, more local production, less global ambition. That child would not call it collapse. They would call it normal. Civilization is not defined by its tallest buildings or fastest networks. It is defined by what humans choose to coordinate together. When coordination expands, civilization feels vast. When coordination narrows, civilization feels small. The human story continues, either way. The question is whether we remain the most synchronized species in history, or become another chapter in the long rhythm of rise and contraction. The crest always feels steady until it doesn't. And whether we stabilize or simplify will depend not on whether pressure arrives. Pressure always arrives. but on whether our surplus, our trust, and our adaptability remain wider than the strain placed upon them. Civilization at scale is not guaranteed. It is maintained every day. Let's end where we began, not with fear, not with apocalypse, with perspective. Imagine a scholar 1,000 years in the future studying sediment layers from our time. They identify a dramatic spike in atmospheric carbon. They find layers dense with microplastics. They uncover foundations of megacities that once held millions. They see the moment humanity harnessed extraordinary energy. They will ask a simple question. Did this civilization stabilize at planetary scale? Or did it contract after peaking? From their vantage point, the answer will look obvious. From ours, it is still unfolding. The pattern of history is not fatalistic. It does not guarantee collapse, but it does show something consistent. Every complex society reaches a point where maintaining scale requires more coordination than ever before. At that point, one of two things happens. Either coordination strengthens and adapts fast enough to match new pressures, or it narrows. Narrowing does not feel like defeat. It feels like simplification. Trade becomes regional. Energy becomes localized. Institutions become smaller. Life continues. But the world feels less connected. The Bronze Age contraction did not erase humanity. The Indus contraction did not erase culture. The Amazon contraction did not erase life. They erased scale. Scale is what we confuse with permanence. We see skyscrapers and think eternity. We see satellites and think transcendence. But scale is conditional. It rests on energy surplus, environmental alignment, institutional trust, and psychological confidence. Remove one pillar briefly, the structure trembles. Remove multiple pillars long enough, the structure shrinks. The real question is not whether we could survive systemic shock. We almost certainly could. The real question is whether we could preserve synchronization across continents under sustained strain. Because synchronization is modern civilization, it is not technology alone that defines us. It is coordination at planetary scale. If that coordination fractures, humanity endures, but something unprecedented in history would recede. There is one final truth hidden beneath all the examples we've explored. Civilization is not destroyed in a single moment. It is maintained daily. Maintenance is invisible when it works. Power grids hum quietly, water flows unnoticed, markets settle without spectacle. Only when maintenance fails do we recognize its magnitude. Ancient societies lost maintenance capacity under pressure. The Bronze Age lost trade maintenance. The Indus lost environmental maintenance. The Amazon lost demographic maintenance. Once maintenance falters long enough, contraction follows naturally. This is not prophecy. It is physics. Energy in must exceed entropy out. Coordination in must exceed fragmentation out. Trust in must exceed distrust out. When those balances hold, scale stabilizes. When they do not, scale narrows. 1,000 years from now, future historians will not debate whether pressure existed. They will debate whether we adapted fast enough, whether we built slack into our systems, whether we preserved trust across distance, whether we diversified energy before dependency tightened too far. They will look at our era as either the moment humanity matured into planetary stability or the moment it reached its highest crest before simplifying. We cannot see the outcome clearly because we are living inside it, but we can see the pattern behind us. Rise, stabilize, strain, adapt, or contract. That rhythm has repeated for millennia. The difference now is scale. Never before has a civilization operated at true planetary integration, which means never before has contraction, if it occurred, affected the entire globe simultaneously. That makes this moment historically unique, not because we are immune, but because the consequences of fragility would be global rather than regional. The question we carried from the beginning was never truly about electricity. It was about whether human coordination at maximum scale can endure sustained pressure without narrowing. The lights going out was only a metaphor. The deeper issue is alignment. Are our energy systems aligned with environmental limits? Are our institutions aligned with demographic realities? Are our expectations aligned with physical constraints? If alignment holds, scale persists. If alignment drifts too far, contraction becomes efficient, and efficiency is persuasive. The final image is simple: a future child standing beneath the sky, either crossed with satellites, aircraft, and signals linking continents, or quieter. Neither image means humanity failed, but only one means we sustained the largest coordinated system in history. Civilization is not destiny. It is discipline. It is the daily act of preserving scale against entropy. History does not promise permanence. It offers warning. And warning is not doom. It is opportunity.